Okay, shalom, shalom, y'all. I've been having some problems with this phone, so if it cuts out on me, then we'll have to do this again or at some other time. But I wanted to just check in with you guys and just, develop another subject that it's kind of been my uh, project here, my pet project here for the past, I guess, almost a year now. Um, Almost a year now. So, yeah, I wanted to go ahead and get into it because it's a concept that people are not familiar with and are really, it's really kind of going over their heads as to how this is so and, how the world really is that we live in. Okay, so the concept that people are not going to get and people are going to try to refute, but is, really plainly in front of you and absolutely true, is that, um, okay, so we've got in America, we've already discussed that the Jews of the Bible are Black Americans and Black victims of the transatlantic slave trade that were scattered across the four corners of the globe. So we know in particular, Black Americans are specifically, at the top of this, transatlantic slave trade bunch, being in the most popular, most wealthy country in the world, um, and then being in this country slaves and second-class citizens and in perpetual poverty and, victims of all of these different types of curses, right? Curses. So when we think of Jews, when we think of what we were, raised to believe and who we were raised to believe the Jews were, we get the picture in our mind of the white man with the curly Q locks, curly Q locks, and we also get the picture of them coming from Europe and then being in Germany and Poland and Eastern Europe, and then also being in these places, housed and packed into concentration camps, and then exterminated via a Holocaust. That's what we were taught to believe growing up. And I do believe that to be true of those particular Jews in Europe during that time, that they did suffer a Holocaust, that they were packed into Jewish ghettos, that they were oppressed in these countries that these particular, white Jews were in. Does that make them, biblically related by blood to the Hebrews of the Bible? No, no, it doesn't mean that whatsoever. It just means that they were oppressed in these countries in that way. But that's besides the point. The point that I'm making here is that in these countries, the story that we get is packed into Jewish ghettos called concentration camps, with names even, and then also put into a Holocaust, into gas chambers and into a situation where, they were poisoned and killed, right? So let's take that story that we know of the Jews in Europe, the story that we know of the Jews that are in Europe, um, and then see if it also applies to what we know about Black people in America today, right? About the history of us being in America. The only history we know of, 400 years here in the United States as slaves and second-class citizens. Does it apply? And let's even look at modern times. We can look at, the entire 400 years, the first from 1619 to 1864 and beyond, being in what's called chattel slavery. You look at that as a whole, as a massive, massive Holocaust with millions of people that were killed and brutally enslaved brutally enslaved, so much so that um, we came out of it uh, generationally scarred, like scarred forever, right? So then you look at the next uh, section era. That first era lasts, what, 250 years? This next era, Jim Crow, from that time all the way up until there are Jim Crow laws on the books still today, but all the way up until, let's just say, 64, 65, around the Civil Rights era, when the Voting Rights Act came down. Let's just call that an era right there of servitude, of captivity. And let's call that the Jim Crow era. So that in itself is a Holocaust and an oppression. Because, of course, we had people hung from trees. We had the Ku Klux Klan. We had the creation of the FBI, the creation of the CIA in this time. And all of those organizations have been responsible for imprisoning and killing and assassinating black people, leaders, and people that were standing up in the community, and people who just, even like the Ku Klux Klan, people who just defied oppression in the places that they were, having their houses burned down, ran out of cities, serious, hardcore oppression. So beyond that, even, let's go from about 1950 to the present day, right? So in America, you have, and I'm going to say this, concentration camps for Jews. Concentration camps for Jews. They call them in America public housing projects. They're concentration camps. And here's how. You look in the 1940s and what happened after World War II. You have a white population that goes off to war, right? White population at this time, we're the Hebrews. This is what you have to do. Since you recognize now that you are a Jew from the Bible, and you didn't know that, that means that somebody did, and somebody didn't train you to know who you were. So that has to be the society that has oppressed you, right? That has to be them. So that means they know who you are. That someone in the society knows who you are. They know who you are. So that's why you don't know who you are. That's why you can be punished in the media for trying to speak out about who you are, because someone else knows who you are and doesn't want you to know. Right? Who is it? Who else is it that knows who you are? But beyond that, okay, someone knows who you are and has kept this information from you, and you have to apply that into the entire backstory of America. So 1940s, what happens? World War II, the liberation of Europe from Nazi Germany, so-called, right? So all of these young white Americans have gone off into war, right? In the 1940s, right? They've gone to war. They're being killed in war. A lot of them being killed in war, right? This war that is, on its surface about liberating Europe from Nazi and Japanese influence, and then not Europe from Japanese influence, but liberating Europe from Nazi influence and defeating the Japanese Empire. So white men are off to war. At this time, the black men are not sent into combat scenarios, not in mass, and not in any significant manner. They are not trained, because the number one soldiers in history, America's not going to risk at this time training them for combat and then having them come back into the United States to unleash that combat on them, right? They are, trying to outsmart themselves, right? So all the white men go off to war in the 1940s, and this leaves a booming economy for black men to get into, with places like GM and all of these steel factories to support the war effort, right? And so, and people don't know this, in the 1940s, America gained a black middle class really, really quickly. You know, in only a couple years, gained a black middle class. And so when the uh, when the soldiers started coming back from war, when the white man started coming back, they started finding themselves having to compete with black men in these jobs that they left behind, and not being able to compete with them, even after coming home from war, having to not have a job because these black men are in these positions and they're doing a good job at it. This is 1940s America. Believe it or not, we had a middle class back then, a booming middle class, because of the war, right? And of course, the powers that be are noticing this. So they started to develop this plan. And the plan started from before then on what to do with the black people, right? What to do with the Hebrews, right? So in the early 20s, they had started building public housing, and started putting white people in there, right? Because after the Depression, you know, the economy, and that's another thing too. The Depression was caused by the growth of a black middle class, and they sank the economy then for, you know, the same reason. That growth of the black middle class is a threat. So after the Depression, they started building public housing in small places, you know, like in New York and in other different places. They started putting white people in there and started allowing them to pay, you know, just very tiny amount to stay, and then build themselves back up to be reintroduced into society. And it turned out that this worked, you know, for the white population that used the housing projects at that time. Then you have, in the same places, you have places where black people live that weren't projects, that were just regular neighborhoods that were tight, close knit, and ended up making a lot of money because of the lack of you know, white men in the 1940s, and then in the 1910s and 20s, the the um, the birth of jazz and blues and that type of music that, you know, caught the world by storm, and, you know, brought a lot of wealth into black communities. So they had to stop some of that. So that's what caused a lot of the economic unrest during that time. But in the 1940s, what happened was that they started to put into plan after the war to redevelop the entire country. This is Roosevelt's New Deal, the Democratic New Deal. And a part of that New Deal, and this is what people don't recognize, is that they were going to build public housing projects in every single city in the United States. And this is because they had planned to put Hebrews there, to put all the black populations, not all, but the ones that they could trick to get in there, definitely, into these places, so that they could house them there in mass incarceration camps. And where it's this that's incarcerated more than anything. It's this that's incarcerated. So check this out. So they started to build these projects all over the country, right? And when these soldiers start coming back, they put white folks in them. They dolled them up, made them look like, oh, this is your ticket into the middle class, right? This is the way that you get out of what you could consider the slum, or what you could consider poverty, even though it wasn't in a lot of situations, or what you could consider the field, because in the rural South, you did still have a lot of farmers and farming. And during these times, that was starting to be less trendy, right? People started wanting to live in cities and move to cities. So you get a lot of people that see this public housing project as a way out, and you see white people in it already and doing well, and then all of a sudden they opened them up to you. Oh, you had people flocking to get into the public housing project system, you know? And then once that happened, uh, there's a book, and I believe it's called The Color of Law, or I can't remember, and it's by this guy named Richard Rothstein, and I think that's his name. But he talks about how, and this is starting to run long, that in the American legal system, it was legislated by law that there were places in America that black people could not buy homes. So during that time, there was a black middle class in the 40s and 50s, and black people could afford to buy homes. There was also government legislation that built and maintained the suburbs. Suburbs weren't a natural occurrence. Suburbs themselves were sponsored by the US government. Sponsored by the US government. There's a huge one called Levittown, right outside of New York City. And it had 17,000 homes in it. This is right from this man's book, right? 17,000 homes built with no buyers. Built all off of government grants and government legislation. Funds got from the government to build 17,000 houses with nobody in them. Because they had planned to build that as a suburb, planned on taking the economy, the industry that was in the cities, and moving them out into the suburbs, leaving the cities, leaving the jobs to the people that can go outside, and abandoning the inner cities to poverty. And that's what happened. They tricked black people to get into the public housing system, and the rent was nearly free. The places were nice. You were around everybody that you loved. Then they began to poison it. They began to poison it. They stopped maintaining them. They inserted gangs from other cultures. They inserted drugs from other countries. They inserted drugs into the community from other countries, which means they had to plan to get those drugs from overseas into you. This is not something that happened from Pablo Escobar or any Colombian or Nicaraguan drug lord. This has to be entire large companies that are able to bring that amount of drugs into the country, distribute it, and for it to successfully poison a generation of people, which is what happened. And the public housing project system was the method in which they disseminated into the whole entire community, because those were the hearts of the community. And then the first generation that stayed there, some of them may have gotten up to the middle class level and took that opportunity. But now you have the psychological dependence upon the person who gave you this apartment, this place to stay. And then they started making laws for people who could be in the projects and who couldn't. And if the man was in the project with you, you couldn't have him. And I have to pause here because my sons need some help here. So I'm gonna jump back on and finish this up. But that's the concentration camp right now in America. And if you say it's not, you're lying.